All right, Rabosai, good morning. Let us begin. I want to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Dovi, and Nina Elman for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of their daughter Ayelet becoming a bas mitzvah. May she continue to be a source of nachas for the entire family. Our week of learning sponsors, Alan and Sherry Steinmetz, in honor of Allison and Adam Steinmetz's anniversary, and in the schos of all of the shiurim offered by the shul. And our Daf Yomi sponsors today, Aryeh and Debbie Langer, in honor of the bar mitzvah of their son Binyamin. May he continue to be a source of nachas to the family and the Ribono Shel Olam. And a very special thank you to Menachem Schoenfeld for the double espresso. I have triple espresso, mamish. I feel it kicking in a little bit. So thank you, Yasher Koach. Okay, good. 1 second. I'm sorry. All right, so Rabbi say, let us begin. Today's daf is Mem Aleph 41. And we are picking up Emir Hashem at the Mishnah on Mem Amud Beis 40b. So it says the Mishnah, Ein nosten kemach leso charoses. So Rabbi say, remember again, picking up a little bit from yesterday's daf, where the Gemara began to discuss certain halachas pertaining to the mixing in of chametz into certain items. Yesterday we saw excuse me. Well, I shouldn't say mixing. Well, yesterday we saw about the concept of adding bran into something that kind of led to a much bigger discussion regarding mixing in flour, as well as the concept of matzah shmura. So continuing a little bit on the same theme, the Mishnah says, "Einosten kemach leso charoses." You can't put flour into charoses. Now, both say, interestingly enough, charoses is not what you think. When the Gemara refers to charoses, it's actually not referring to our charoses that we use at the Seder. Rather, if you look at Rashi says charoses v'yesh bo chometz v'asui letabel bo basar. This was a dip which was used for meat. It was a meat dip that had vinegar in it. That's the operative piece over here. It had vinegar in it. That's why so it's called charoses. So you can't go ahead and put flour into charoses in order to thicken it up, or into mustard for that matter. V'im nasan yochal miyad. But if you did go ahead and place the vinegar if you did place the flour into the vinegar or into the charoses or into the mustard, you should eat it immediately. So the Tanakama holds there's a concern that it may become chametz. The way to obviate that concern is eat it as soon as possible. Meir holds that it's asra. Meir holds that once you introduce flour or once you introduce flour into charoses or into the chardal, so it becomes almost instantaneously chametz, and you have to discard it immediately. It's actually very exciting because today we're going to get into the sugya of Karban Pesach, which is very exciting. First of all, it's exciting because Pesach, it's amazing, is only 90 days away. Now it's less, it's 88 days away, which is actually pretty amazing if you think about just the dramatic passage of time. So now already, again, we're going to begin to see the halachos of Karban Pesach, and the amazing part is that, there's a concept. We say karbanos every single day, right? There's a very important idea of saying karbanos. The Parshas HaKiyur, Parshas HaTamid, Parshas HaKtores, Ezuhu Mekoman. Very important. Why? Because when you say karbanos, there's a concept, the Gemara says, of uneshama parim sefasenu, according to the pasuk from Tehillim, that literally, again, we will neshama means pay, but we will go ahead and create a carbonic experience with our lips. There's a concept in Chazal that even when you can't go ahead and offer up karbanos, the ability to go ahead and recite the psukim of karbanos makes it as if you're offering up karbanos. So therefore, in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash, Halavai will be zochet to the Bayis Shlishim here, Rabbi Yameinu. Until that time, we have the ability to offer up karbanos every single day through the recitation of karbanos. So it's really something amazing. So when we learn about Karban Pesach, there is a quasi-kiyum of Karban Pesach, and it's also incredible. Why? Because normally when it comes to Karban Pesach, you could only offer up Karban Pesach on Pesach. But when you learn about Karban Pesach, it's a ki'ilu, you're offering up the karban, and the amazing part is I could do that even in Teves. Right? If the Beis HaMikdash stood, I could not go and offer up the Karban Pesach in Teves. But when I learn about the Karban Pesach in Teves, there's a quasi-kiyum of Hakravas HaKarban even in Teves. So really incredible. Rabbi Mazel Tov again. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. So we'll say, the Gemara says, the Mishnah says as follows: You can't cook the Karban Pesach in liquids or in fruit juices. Again, we'll define the parameters of this. Aval sachin umatbilin osa bahen. But you can, I don't know what the right lashon for this is, when you're roasting a piece of meat and like you put liquid on, is it basting? Basting, right? But you can baste the carbon. So we'll say, we're going to see, by the way carbon Pesach was made was, you essentially would put a spit through the animal from its mouth, and it would come out the backside of the animal. The animal would be roasted whole and be roasted over an open fire. So you can't cook the carbon Pesach in liquid, but you can baste it while you're roasting it. And similarly, again, the waters used by a baker should go ahead and be spilled out, ultimately, again, because they become chametz. Again, we'll discuss the parameters of that in a little bit as well. Amar Rav Kahana, machlokes l'soch hachardal. The machlokes ultimately is when you go ahead and you put flour into mustard, but if you go ahead and you put flour into the charoses, everyone agrees according to this price, you have to burn it immediately. They both say, what's the distinction? Because halacha l'maisa, again, apparently vinegar expedites the chimutz process. So because of that, if you go ahead and you mix flour into your charoses, you have to burn it immediately. That supports this. Excuse me. We don't go ahead and put flour into charoses. If you went ahead and you put flour into your charoses, yisaref miyad. You have to go ahead and burn it immediately. What if you went ahead and you put flour into your mustard? Rabbi Meir omer yisaref miyad. Rabbi Meir says that we go ahead and we tell you, burn it immediately, and the Chachamim say you could eat it immediately. Amar Rav Huna Bar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, halacha k'divrei Chachamim. The halacha is like the divrei Chachamim. Namely, Rabbosai, that according to this approach, everyone will agree that if you put flour into the charoses, you should burn the mixture immediately. If you put flour into mustard, Chachamim hold you could eat it. You just should eat it immediately. And now Rav Huna is saying the halacha follows the Chachamim. Shmuel, halacha k'divrei Chachamim. Amali Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Rav Huna Rav Yehuda. Acharoses ka'amar o achardal ka'amar. When you say that, top of Mem Aleph. When you say that the halacha follows the Chachamim, what are you referring to? Are you referring to charoses or chardal? In other words, are you referring to both? So obviously, everyone agrees that by charoses, by charoses. According to this approach, everyone is holding that halacha l'maisa, if you went ahead and you put it into the charoses, you destroy it immediately. The chardal case is the machlokes case. Rabbi Meir says you have to burn it immediately. The chacham say you can eat it. So when we say that the halacha follows the chachamim, are you talking about by chardal or charoses? Amrlei l'may nafkamino. What does it matter? L'drav kahana, dam Rav Kahana machlokes l'socha chardal. Shabbos say Rav Kahana, because what did Rav Kahana say? The machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim is in the following case, is into the chardal. Is that that's only when the Chachamim say you should eat it immediately, and Rabbi Meir says that you should burn it. Avalasocha charoses. But when it comes to charoses, divrei hakol yisaref miyad. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, you should burn it immediately. So the Gemara says, Amrlei lo shniyali. He said, I never heard this. Kilomar lo svirali. Shabbos say, so apparently, again, what he was saying was, I don't hold of this distinction of Rav Kahana. Amar Rav Ashi Kavasid Rav Kahana Mistabra. No, Rav Kahana's interpretation, in fact, seems to be authoritative. How so, says the Gemara? So we'll say, so how so? The Gemara says, Amar Shmuel, Ein halacha k'Rabbi Yossi. From the fact that Shmuel says that the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yossi. And I remember again, Abosai, Rabbi Yossi was in yesterday's daf. Rabbi Yossi was of the opinion that vinegar causes the chimutz process. It appears, at least if not to stop, for sure to stop, it might even be a little bit of reversal. Remember again, Rabbi Yossi was of the opinion that if your barley kernels were in water and they began to open up, which is a sign of chimutz, so Rabbi Yossi says, what do? Just put them in vinegar. And if you put it in vinegar, it will actually contract. So Shmuel said, halacha does not follow Rabbi Yossi. My love, tzamusi hu delot tzamis. Ha-chamui michamea. So I will say, does that not sound like what? That he holds that ultimately, again, vinegar doesn't have the ability to contract, but vinegar does have the ability to make something chametz, in which case, again, halacha lemaisa, including flour, introducing flour into the charoses could be problematic. Lo dilma lo mitzamis tzamis v'lo chamua mechami. No, maybe what he's saying is that vinegar doesn't have the ability to contract. In other words, it doesn't have the ability to impede or to reverse the chimutz process, but it also does not have the ability to go ahead and make something chametz. Shabbos say, so this is the discussion. It appears that ultimately, Shabbos say, just so you should know, from a halacha l'maisa perspective, we on Pesach pretty much we don't introduce flour into anything. Right? That's just the general rule. That's why I will say, whatever we would normally use for flour over the course of the year on Pesach, you use matzah meal. Right? That's just because, again, I will say, and why is that you begin to see it, because obviously any time you begin to introduce flour into any kind of substance, what you begin to see over here, I will say, is that there's a machlokes and mitzias. Right? How does flour interact with different things? How does flour interact with vinegar? How does flour interact with mustard? And that's why you even see a reluctance to introduce roasted flour. That was yesterday's daf. Right? In a case of roasted flour, where they're about to say it's been cooked already, but you see a reluctance in halacha to really go ahead and tamper with these things, because if you're off, and if you're wrong, you're dealing with potentially surim d'oraisa. Okay, good. Says the Gemara, Im mevashlin. So we'll say now we're going to get into some really interesting sugyas regarding the preparation of Karban Pesach. It's very exciting. Tanu Rabbanon. B'mayim, so we'll say, so the Torah says, just to give you the pasuk, Al tochlu mimenu na, uvashal bushal mimayim. You should not eat from it na. Then I will say, na literally means, how would you literally translate na? Raw. We'll see that's actually not what na means. We'll discuss in just a little bit. So you can't go and eat from the Karban Pesach na, ubashal mavushal b'mayim, or cooked in water, ki im tzli. You have to eat it roasted. So watch this. Says the Gemara, b'mayim. So you have to go ahead and drink. You can't eat the Karban Pesach cooked in water. Inli ella b'mayim. I only know about water. Shar mashkiminayim. How do I know that I can't cook Karban Pesach in other liquids as well? Amrit kal v'chomer. You said it's a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Uma mayim she'in mafigin taimon asurin sharmashkin she'et mafigin taimon lokol shekein. See, Rabbi say, when you cook something in water, the water does not impact the taste of the item. So yet, again, halacha l'maisa, I'm not allowed to go ahead and cook something in water, even though water does not impact the taste of the item. So alachas kama v'kama, all the more so, other juices or other liquids which have their own flavor, which will impact the Karban Pesach, certainly will be aser. Very interesting. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Omer, b'mayim inli ela b'mayim, shamashki minayin. Rabbi says, Mayim only tells me I can't cook the Karban Pesach in water. How do I know that I can't cook the Karban Pesach in other liquids? Talmud Lomar, ubashal mavushal mikol makom. So the Torah says bashal mavushal. So I'll say bashal mavushal, according to Rebbe, means halacha l'maisa, you can't cook the Karban Pesach in anything. So right, so the Torah says ubashal mavushal b'mayim. So mayim teaches me I can't cook it in water. Bashal mavushal means what? I can't cook it in any other liquid as well. So we'll say, interestingly enough, everyone's agreeing that you can't cook the Karban Pesach neither in water or other liquids. The shaila is where you're learning it out from. So the first opinion holds, right? We'll call it the Tanakama holds, the Rabbanon hold, that halacha l'maisa it's a kal v'chomer. If water, which doesn't impact the taste of the meat, you can't cook the Karban Pesach in it, alachas kama v'kama, other juices which do impact the taste, you can't cook the Karban Pesach in it. Rebbe holds no. My pasuk tells me mayim, and bashal mavushal teaches me what? Even other liquids. My benai. So also, what's the practical difference between these approaches? My benai. Ika benai tzli kedar. So we'll say this is very interesting. The nafkamina would be able to say tzli kedar. Tzli kedar, I think, is what we colloquially call today pot roast. I was about to say, imagine for a moment you were to put the Karban Pesach in a pot. No liquids. But what will happen if you cook the Karban Pesach in a pot? In a pot over an open fire. What's going to happen? The juices of the carbon are going to come out, and then the carbon will cook in its own juices. Now, Rabbi say, interestingly enough, think about this for just a moment. Is that going to impact the taste? Is it going to impact the taste? No, it's the juices of the same animal. But Lamaisa, it's still cooking the carbon Pesach ultimately again in juices. In juices, look at Rashi. Rashi says, Tzli Kedar, Shemavashlan also Bikidera below Mayim, you cook it in a pot. And when I say cook it, meaning this is on an open fire. You put it in a pot over an open fire below Mayim without any water. Below Shumashke, Ela Mayim Haniflatin Mishmano. So we'll say the only liquids that come out are the liquids of the carbon itself. So the Gemara says, Lamandi Yalifle Mikal V'chomer HaChashari, the Rebbe the Melech Meribuya Hainami Afbashal Lavush. Suppose according to the Rabbanon, who learned it out from the Kal V'chomer, this should be permitted. Why should this be permitted? Because Rabbi say this is not what we'll call it a foreign liquid, right? This is its own liquid. But according to Rebbe, he learns it out that Bashal Lavushal comes to include all liquids. That would come to include Tzli Kedar as well. Patros is Rabbi say we'll see in the Rambam if we have time today. If not, during the subsequent shiurim, that Allah L'maisa, you can't cook a pot roast carbon Pesach. You cannot do that. We're going to see it has to be over an open fire. It can't pool in its own liquids as well, its own juices as well. But Rabbanon, hi Bashal Mavushal my Avdilahu. So say so the Rabbanon. See, I both say the Rabbanon learn out that you can't cook the carbon Pesach in any type of liquid from a Kal V'chomer. If the Torah tells me I can't cook it in water, which doesn't impact the taste, I certainly can't cook it in any other liquid which will impact the taste. So what do the Rabbanon do with the phrase Bashal Mavushal? So watch this. It's very interesting. Bishlo v'achar kach tzlo. O tzlo v'achar kach bishlo. Chayiv. Let's listen to this interesting case. If you first cooked the carbon, I will say, just to be clear, when we speak about bishul in the Gemara, bishul means what? Cooking in a liquid medium. That's always what bishul means. So if you cooked the carbon Pesach, you cooked it in liquid, and then you roasted it, or you roasted it first and then you cooked it, chayiv. Ultimately, again, I will say you will be chayiv malchus for eating in a legally prepared carbon Pesach. So bishlama, bishlova, achakach, tzlo, chayiv, dahabashle. So I understand the case of where you first cook the carbon Pesach and then roast it. Because halach lamaisa, I cooked it. So because I cooked it, I violated a halacha. Ela tzlo v'achakach bishlo. But I will say, if I first roasted it and then cooked it, why should that be aser? Hatzli ishu. So that's the issue. I'm supposed to say, this is actually very interesting. If I first roasted the carbon Pesach, and then I subsequently went ahead and cooked it, why should that be problematic? At the end of the day, I roasted it. And we should say, once I roasted it, its identity as tzli'esh has been locked in, and ein al ma ledaber, there's nothing more to talk about. Why should it be problematic? To which the Gemara says, Amrav Kahana, Haman Rabbi Yosihi. This is Rabbi Yosi. Disanya Yotzim Berako Kashar Mavushal Shaloni Muach Divrei Emer. This is actually very interesting. By matzah, we had this earlier. If you have a matzah, rakik is a wafer, but if you have a matzah, imagine you have a matzah that is sharui, that is soaked, or mavushal, or cooked, but is not dissolved. So Rabbi says, so what's the halacha? Rabbi Meir says that halacha l'maisa, you could be yotzei matzah with that. Rabbi Yosi Omer Yotzin Berako Kasharoi Avalo B'Mavushal Afa Pishaloni Muach. Rabbi Yosi, on the other hand, holds you could use a soaked matzah, right? The matzah that's been soaked as long as it's intact, but you can't use a matzah that has been cooked, even if it hasn't dissolved, even if it's still intact. And why not, Rabbi Yossi? So interestingly enough, because you see Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, once you cook something, it loses its original status. So once you go ahead and you cook matzah, even though it was previously baked, the subsequent act of cooking negates the previous act of baking. So too Rabbi Yossi would say over here that in a case where you roasted the carbon Pesach and then you cooked it, even though you initially roasted it, you did what you were supposed to do, halacha l'maisa, the subsequent act of cooking negates the previous act of roasting. Ula Amar Afilu Tema Rabbi Meir. Ula would say the truth is even Rabbi Meir would agree in this case. Shaini Hacha da Amar Kra ubashal mavushal mikamakam. So we keep coming back to that drasha, that bashal mavushal means Karban Pesach that has been cooked in any way. And any way literally means any way. So even if you first roasted it and then you cooked it, you can't eat a Karban Pesach which has been cooked, right? Whether it's in its own juices, whether it's in water, whether it's in fruit juices, whether you roasted it first and then cooked it, whether you cooked it and then roasted it. If it was cooked in any way, the Karban Pesach is invalid for use. Tan Rabbanon, Yachol Slow Kol Tzar Kol Yehi Chayiv. So it's actually an interesting case as well. One might have thought that if you fully cooked it or fully roasted it, that you would be chayiv. Now, say when they say chayiv over here means for eating an illegally prepared Karban Pesach. So the Gemara says, Talmud Omer al tochlu mimenu na ubashal mavushal b'mayim. So therefore the Torah tells you can't eat from it na, which will translate for now as raw, but at the end, or bashal mavushal. So what do you see from here? Na ubashal mavushal amarti lecha. Ultimately, again, so you can't eat from the Karban Pesach na, right? Either raw or cooked. Velo shetzlo kol tarcho, but not something that has been fully cooked. So Gemara says, what are you talking? What does that mean, fully cooked? So Hechi Dami Amravashi the Shav Yecharuch. Rabbi say this is fascinating. Let's say you charred your Karban Pesach, right? You charred your Karban Pesach. So Rabbi say, so the Gemara says, let's say you mamish, it's overdone. It's overdone to the point that it is a charred lump of meat. So the Gemara says, so you might have thought that you are not Yotzei Karban Pesach like that. Kamash Malon, you are. You could overcook it as much as you want. The problem is if it's cooked or raw. Boss, I have to tell you, this is one of the most wonderful Gemaras that I've learned in a very long time. I'll tell you why. For I know that I'm a miyut sheba miyut, but for those of us who like our meat very, very, very overcooked. Very overcooked. So, Lemaisa, again, this Gemara is an affirmation that we will have a seat at the table when the Beis HaMikdash is back and the Karban Pesach is back. I don't think I'll have anyone who wants to join in my chabura, right? No one's going to want to eat Karban Pesach the way I want to eat Karban Pesach. But Lemaisa, again, it's very interesting about say, see, even if the meat is severely overcooked, right? Halacha Lemaisa, the Gemara says that is absolutely okay. Good. So the Gemara goes weiter. You might have thought that if you eat a raw piece, now both say. So now remember I mentioned before, we're going to see two different terms. There's chai and na. So we'll say chai is the word that the Gemara uses for absolutely raw. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says chai legamrei shelo nitzla klal, mamish raw. We're going to see that both say na just means undercooked. Undercooked. So watch this. So turn around, but we learned in a brayso, Yochol achol kizayis chay chayiv. You might have thought that if you eat a raw piece of Karban Pesach meat, that you would be chayiv for a legal consumption of Karban Pesach. Talmud lomar atochlo mimenu na ubashal mavushal. Na ubashal amarti lechavelo chayiv. Said it's actually very interesting. The biblical prohibition is not on eating raw Karban Pesach. The biblical prohibition is eating undercooked Karban Pesach, which is quite fascinating. Which I both say makes sense because again, remember the Torah only legislates in normal fashion. We assume that people aren't going to eat raw meat. Well, this is interesting because we were managed doing this sugya in Hilchos Muktzah about the status of raw meat on Shabbos. So again, the Gemara says we make this. So the Torah doesn't put down a prohibition by raw consumption, only by undercooked consumption. Yachol yehe mutter. So you might have thought it would be mutter. No, so therefore I'll say maybe if I want to eat my Karban Pesach raw, I have the right to do that. Talmud lomar ki'im tzli esh. Therefore we'll say the pasuk says that you could only go ahead and eat it roasted on fire. So we'll say what's the case? Hechi dami na. So we'll say what is the case of na? It's actually very interesting. Amarav kida amri parsoi abarnayim. Shabbos says, so na is what the Persians called abarnayim. So look at Rashi, Kida Amri Parsai abarnayim, Osa Tzuliya Shebeloshon Parsi Kruya abarnayim, Beloshon HaKodesh Karina. Shabbos say, so it must be very like a really undercooked form. In other words, not even like a rare, but probably even something less than that, where just people wouldn't really eat meat like that. So therefore, Halacha L'maisa, the na ultimately tells you can't eat what would be conventionally considered to be undercooked Karban Pesach. Very interesting. I'm going to have Chista. Hamavashal b'chamei tiveria b'Shabbos pater. But it's an interesting case. Rav Chisda says if you cook with chamei tiveria, we'll say so chamei tiveria, the hot springs of Tiberia. So if you cook food in the hot springs of Tiberia, you are pater. Now we'll say we'll discuss what that is. Look at Rashi. Rashi's chamei tiveria mayaros roasting. So we'll say these are hot springs. So if you cook in hot springs on Shabbos, ultimately again you are pater. So the Gemara says Pesach shebishlo b'chamei tiveria. So we'll say it's very interesting. What about if you cooked your carbon Pesach in chamei tiveria? So remember again, I'm not allowed to eat carbon Pesach that's cooked. What if I didn't cook it in fire? I cooked it over chamei tiveria. So what's the halacha? Ultimately, the Gemara says, Pesach shemishlo b'chamei tiveria chayiv. If I cook my carbon Pesach in chamei tiveria, I'm going to be chayiv. So we'll say, meaning what do you mean chayiv? If I eat that carbon Pesach that has been cooked in chamei tiveria, I am in violation for illegal consumption of carbon Pesach. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Maishna b'Shabbos telo, the toldos ishpa inon. So why is it that if I cook in chamei tiveria on Shabbos, that I'm not chayiv, right? Why is that? Because halacha l'maisa, on Shabbos, I'm only chayiv for toldos ish. I'm only chayiv if I cook with something that is heated by fire. Veleka, and therefore again, chamei tiveria is not fire. But Pesach nami lav toldos ishu. By Pesach, ultimately, again, it's not toldos ish either, so why would I be chayiv? Amarava my chayiv diktani dika'avar mishum tzli ish. So Rav says, you're right. What does it mean when we say that you're chayiv? It means that you're in violation of tzli ish. So we'll say, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Mishum tzli ish, lav delo tochal kiim tzli ish ika. Velo lav de bishol savar alav shebechalos. So this is very interesting. When the Torah says ki in tzliish, you have to eat the Karban Pesach tzliish, roasted on fire. The Gemara is understanding now that if you eat Karban Pesach prepared in any other way, you are in violation of that lav. You're in violation, and therefore you would get malchus. We'll get into this in just a little bit. There's something called a lav shebechlolos. We're going to see that in the world of lav, in the world of prohibitions, there are two different types of prohibitions. There's a specific lav. We're going to see the paradigmatic example of that as lo sachsom sharbedisho. Don't muzzle an ox when it plows. It's specific. It's clear. It's targeted. And then you have other lavim that are more general. For example, the Torah says you could only go ahead and eat the Karban Pesach tzli'esh. Well, you could infer a number of prohibitions. What are the prohibitions you could infer from that statement? Anything that's what? That's what? Not tzli'esh will be prohibited. That now we'll say that's a non-explicit or non-specific lav. That's what's called in halacha a lav shebechlolos, a general lav. So we're going to discuss, can you get malchus for a lav shebechlolos or not? We'll see that. So Rav Chibri, Rav Nasan, Masni Leilahad, Rav Chista Behedja, Amar Rav Chista, Hamavashal b'chamei tiveria b'Shabbos pater. If you go ahead and you cook in chamei tiveria on Shabbos, you are pater. Upesach shetzelo b'chamei tiveria. But if you have a Pesach, because we'll say again, you're going to be pater on Shabbos because it's not toldos ish, it's not fire. Upesach shebishlo b'chamei tiveria. But if you cook the carbon Pesach and chamei tiveria, chayiv, you will be chayiv. Why? She'avar mishum tzli ish. Because we'll say you are in violation of the statement of tzli ish. The Torah says that Karban Pesach has to be roasted on fire. You prepared it in a different manner and you also consumed it. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, you will be in violation of that particular lav. Amar Rava. So we'll say, let's analyze a bit more. Amar Rava. Achlo na. If we must remember again, our terms are very important. If you ate it, na. So it's interesting because up until this Gemara, I think most of us would have translated na as raw. When in fact, that's not what it means. It means undercooked. So if you eat the Karban Pesach undercooked, lo keshtayim. Interestingly enough, you'll get 2 sets of malchus. Why 2 sets of malchus? Look at Rashi, lo keshtayim, mishum lo sochal na, or mishum lo sochlu kiyim tzli'esh. So we'll say, interesting, you'll get 2 sets of malchus. One, because there's a specific prohibition about eating Karban Pesach undercooked. And number 2, you're in violation of the general mandate, kiyim tzli'esh, to eat it roasted. No umavushal. Similarly, again, if you ate a Karban Pesach that is undercooked and or cooked, right, undercooked and muvushal, lo shalosh. You'll ultimately again get 3 sets of malchus, right? 1 for na, 1 for mavushal, and 1 for kiyim tzliesh. Abai Amar ein lokin alav shebechlalos. Abai says, no, we don't administer malchus, Rabbosai, for what we call a lav shebechlalos. We don't administer malchus for a general lav, like Rabbosai, like kiyim tzliesh, right? Because Rabbosai, remember again, what the Gemara is doing over here is the Gemara is saying kiyim tzliesh is another lav. And what it's telling you is you could only eat the carbon roasted, and therefore what? Anything that's not roasted is illegal. So therefore you get malchus for eating any type of carbon that's not prepared in a roasted fashion. Abai says, we don't give malchus for lavim like that. We'll see. Ike da amri, tartihu delalaki, mchada mihas laki. So we'll say, some say, we won't give 2 sets of malchus, but we'll give 1 set of malchus. Ike da amri, chada nami lo laki, interestingly enough, what I want to point out is something fascinating to you. The Torah speaks about the prohibition of malchus. And where does the Torah speak about it? The Torah speaks about it here, let me show you. If you have the psukim listed on the side of the Gemara, you'll see the Torah says, Arban Yakenu, speaks about malchus. Right after the Torah speaks out malchus, it says, Lo sachsom shor bedisho. You may not muzzle an ox when it threshes, which is exactly as it sounds. You can't muzzle an ox when it threshes. So I will say the juxtaposition of malchus to lo sachsom, the Gemara uses to espouse the following idea, which is the only time you get malchus is for a lav that is explicit and specific. Just like lo sachsom shar bedisho is an explicit and specific lav, so too you will only get malchus for a lav that is explicit and specific. What does this exclude? This would exclude what we call a lav shebechlalos. This is according to Abaye. A lav shebechlalos. So we'll say any lav that's general. For example, we'll say, what's a good example of a general lav? Kiyim tzliesh. Kiyim tzliesh. What do you learn out from tzliesh? That anything that's not tzliesh is usr. Well, that's a very general lav. So Abaye will say, we do not give malchus on a lav shabbalachal. So Rambam will say, and that is indeed how the Rambam himself paskins, that in order to get malchus for a lav, it has to be a specific and explicit lav, like lo sachsum shar bedisho. But any lav that is more general, lav shabbachalos, it's usr, of course, but you don't get malchus. Good, let's go weiter. Rav Amar. Excuse me. Sorry. Rava says as follows. Rava Amar, Achal Zog Lo Keshtayim. This is very interesting. If you eat a zog, is literally a grape skin. This is by a Nazir. If a Nazir goes ahead and eats a grape skin, he gets 2 malchus. 2 sets of malchus. Chartzon, if he eats a grape seed, Lo Keshtayim, he also goes ahead and gets malchus. Shabbos said the assumption over here is what? The assumption, excuse me, if you look at Rashi, Achal zog lo keshtayim, nazir sha'ach lo mishum zog lo yochal, or mishum kala shari asem gefen hayayin. So I will say, interestingly enough, when it comes to the prohibition of the nazir, there's really 2 lavim. One lav ultimately is to go ahead. The pasuk is miyayin v'sheichar yayin v'chometz yayin v'chosheichar lo yishte v'chomishras anavim lo yishte v'anavim lachim v'yiveshim lo yochal kol yimei nizor mikol sheri asem megefan yayin mechartzon v'ad zag. On one hand, the Torah says that you can't eat the grape skin. The Torah says you can't eat the grape skin, but the Torah also says that anything that comes from grapes you can't eat as well. You can't eat as well. So therefore, the Gemara is suggesting if you go ahead, the Nazir eats from the grape skin, he'll get 2 sets of malchus. 1 for the prohibition of eating the grape skin, and 1 for the general prohibition of eating anything that comes from grapes. Similarly, again, if a Nazir eats the grape seeds, lo geshtayim, he'll go ahead and get 2 sets of malchus. 1 for eating, because again, the Torah explicitly says, excuse me, the seed, chartzanim, and the Torah also says a general prohibition of eating things that come from the grapes. Zog v'chartzon. What happens if you eat both the skin and the seed? Lo keshalosh. You'll get 3 sets of malchus. Abai Amar Ein Lokin Alav Shebechlalos. Abai says, no, we don't do this. In other words, you get one set of malchus for the skin, one set of malchus for the seeds, but we do not go ahead and administer malchus for a general lav. Others say you won't even get one set of malchus. Ultimately, again, because the lav is not specific, like the lav of lo sachso. Okay, good. Shabbos says, so ultimately, again, we just kind of digressed a little bit over here, but this concept of lav shebechlolos is an interesting one, a very interesting one. Generally, again, I will say everyone will agree that obviously a specific and explicit lav will generate an obligation for malchus. What do you do when you have what we call a lav shebechlolos, a more general lav? That halacha lemaisa, again, like sli eish, so that's the subject of machlokes. Good, Tan Rabbanon. Achol kizayis lambi ba'od yom pater. We'll see this interesting case now. Remember, you're shechting your carbon pesach on Erev Pesach, during the day, obviously. Let's say you go ahead and you eat a kizayis of carbon pesach that's undercooked before Yom Tov starts. You're eating it before Yom Tov. What's the halacha? Pater. So we'll say, why are you pater? Because the prohibition to eat carbon pesach only applies when? On Pesach, right? On Pesach. So if you eat it before Yom Tov starts, you're going to be pater. So the Gizera says, Kizayis no min shechashecha chayiv. But obviously, if you eat a Kizayis of carbon pesach undercooked at night, then of course you will be chayiv. Achol Kizayis slimi ba'oyom. Similarly, if you ate a Kizayis of carbon pesach that was roasted, so we'll say you began to roast your current Pesach, obviously before Yom Tov starts, and you ate a kizayis of it before Yom Tov starts. You jumped the gun a little bit, little to'amel, right? You went ahead and you jumped the gun a little bit. You ate a kizayis of tzli before Yom Tov starts. Lo pasal atzma mimnei chabura. Interestingly enough, that does not preclude you from being part of a chabura, from being part of the group to eat the current Pesach at night. However, kizayis tzli mishechashecha. But if you go ahead and you eat a kizayis of tzli, right? A kizayis of proper, this is interesting. You're eating a kizayis of properly prepared carbon pesach, but you're eating it by yourself. Pasal asam mibnei chabura. You have pasaled, you have invalidated yourself from joining with your carbon pesach group. Now, say, what's happening over here? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, lo paslas atzom mibnei chabura. De amrina lekamon eina pesach nechal lo b'shtei chaburos ke'echad ve'eina ochal b'shnei mekomos v'nakflam b'ayis echad yochal mitargemina b'chabura chado yisachel v'achilim od yom lavachilahi. Let me just read one more Rashi. However, kizayis tzlim meshechashecha mipesach shin malav pas asom nechabura kedeprisha she'ina ochal mutar lechal imeno b'shnei mechos. So also listen to this. So this is fascinating. If you go ahead and you eat a kizayis tzli of your carbon pesach, but you eat it before Yom Tov starts, you shouldn't do it, but you could still be part of the chabura that night. But interestingly enough, listen to this case. If you eat a kizayis of tzli from your carbon pesach once Yom Tov starts, but you didn't eat it with your chabura, you're eating it on your own. You're eating it on your own. Halacha l'maisa, you are precluded from subsequently joining with your chabura for a carbon pesach consumption. And the logic of it, we'll see later on, is that the halachas carbon pesach could only be eaten with one chabura, and carbon pesach could only be eaten in one place. So when you go ahead and eat the kizayis of tzli first on your own, without your chabura, so therefore you've eaten carbon pesach, to then go and eat it again with your chabura would be tantamount to be eating it in two places with two chaburas, which is aser. Very interesting. Tanya idach, another brayso, yochel ochel kizayis nam be'od yom yechayiv. You might have thought that if you eat a kizayis of carbon pesach, right, undercooked, that Allah chalamayse you would be chayiv. V'dinhu uma b'shah sheyeshno bekum echol tzli yeshno b'bal tochal. No. So we'll say you might have thought as follows: when ultimately again there's an obligation to eat the carbon pesach roasted. Right, roasted. There is a prohibition to eat it raw. All the more so again when there is no obligation to eat it by tzli. Certainly there should be a prohibition to eat it. No. Olo, or maybe not. Olo. Or we'll say, maybe we say, no, the opposite. When is there a prohibition to eat it raw? Only when there's an obligation to eat it roasted. But if there's no obligation to eat it roasted, i.e. before Yom Tiv starts, there's no prohibition to eat it. No, v'al shari hotro michlalo eitzel tzli. Talmud lomar al tochlu mimenu na ubashal muvushal b'mayim ki im tzli. Therefore, also the Torah says, you shall not eat of it, na, raw, undercooked, bashal muvushal b'mayim, and cooked in water, ki im tzli. She'ena Talmud lomar ki im tzli. Uma Talmud lomar ki im tzli. So why is the Torah didn't need to say ki im tzli? Why does the Torah state it? Lomar lecha b'shah sheyeshno bekum echol tzli yeshno bebal tochal no. B'shah she'eno bekum echol tzli eno bebal tochal no. So I will say the Gemara says something very interesting. I will say which is a fascinating limud. These concepts are linked. When is there a prohibition to eat the Karban Pesach? No, only when there is an obligation to eat it tzli. But when there is no obligation to eat it tzli, therefore what? There's no prohibition to eat it no. How does this translate practically for us? This is why the Gemara said before that halacha l'maisa, if on Erev Pesach, before Yom Tiv starts, you eat a piece of your Karban Pesach no, undercooked, what's the halacha? You are not in violation of anything. Again, we'll say obviously it's not encouraged. It's not good. But lamaisa, it's not biblically prohibited. Which again, I will say it's a very intuitive limud. That halacha lamaisa, the prohibited manners of consumption of Karban Pesach only apply when there's an obligation to consume the Karban Pesach in the permitted way. So when there's an obligation of tzliesh, there's a prohibition ultimately again of na'u bashal mavushal. But when there is no obligation of tzliesh, there is no prohibition of bashal mavushal. Rabbi Omer, akra'ani bashal. So what Rabbi says, I don't understand. Why doesn't it just say bashal? Matal lomer mavushal. So what's Rabbi just saying? Excuse me. Why does it have to say mavushal? It could just say bashal. Shiyachal eini ela shebishla mishechashecha. You might have thought maybe the only prohibition is when ultimately again the item is cooked at night. However, bishlomi ba'od yominai, how do I know that it is prohibited even if the item was cooked, even if the Karban Pesach was cooked by day? In other words, both say, you might have thought that bashal mavushal only says that halacha l'maisa, it's asur if you cooked it at night. That's when you can't eat it. But how do you know that even if you cooked it by day, you still can't eat that at night? Talmud lomar bashal mavushal mikol makom. Therefore, we'll say the Torah says bashal mavushal. In all situations of bishla, it's going to be asur. Whether you cooked it at night, whether you cooked it at day. V'hai bashal mavushal afke Rebbe litzli kedar l'shar mashkin. But Rebbe needs bashal mavushal. We saw this in the Gemara. Rebbe said you need bashal mavushal for something else. What do you need bashal mavushal for? Bashal mavushal ultimately teaches me tzli kedar and other mashkin that halacha l'maisa. You have to go ahead. You have to go, there is a prohibition to consume Karban Pesach, which is prepared in any type of liquid. Imkein lemakra, o bashal, o mavushal. If that's the case, the Torah could have just used the same word twice. Either bashal, or mavushal. My bashal mavushal. But say ultimately again, what does bashal mavushal teach me? Shamas mina tarti. It teaches me two halachas. So we'll say, according to, what are the two halachas? Halacha number one, that whenever you cooked it, ultimately, again, it's going to be asur, right? Whether you cooked it by day, you cooked it by night. And number two, bashal mavushal means that when the Karban Pesach is prepared in any type of liquid, it is going to be asur. So whether, again, it's water, whether it's shar mashkin, whether it's its own juices, halacha l'maisa, the Karban Pesach ultimately will be asur. So I'll just share with you the Rambam, very quickly, just in the last few moments that we have together. So the Rambam discusses a lot of these halachas, right? So first of all, the Rambam, I'll actually share this on the, I forgot to put this out on the WhatsApp group before the shir, but just some of the halachos that we covered over the course of today. So first of all, the Rambam writes, No shezhira lav Torah hu basar shehischil bo maisa or v'nitzla ma'at ve'eno roi lachilas adam adayin. Shabbos says this is very important. Number one, no, which I think many of us often translate as raw. As raw, the Rambam says does not mean raw. it means undercooked. By the way, this is the Rambam Hilchos Karban Pesach, Perek Shmini Halach. This is the halachos Hey through Tes. So the Rambam says number one halacha lemaisa. So na doesn't mean raw. Na means undercooked. Now here's what's interesting about this. What's the definition of undercooked? Right. So the Rambam says that it's not ro'i la'achilas adam. That ultimately, again, it's not fit for human consumption. So I will say, so this obviously is going to be somewhat subjective. Now, what I would say is in the realm of subjectivity, even subjectivity has its limitations. So let's assume for a moment that normal people eat things very rare. I would argue on that, but let's assume for a moment that there's a sense of, but obviously there must be a certain threshold below that where even, rare eaters would say, no, that's just not cooked. So obviously, again, halacha. Now you always have people who are outliers, klal gadol in life, right? But lemaisa again, it was ever considered to be roi lachilas adam. Avalim acha mimenu basar chai. Interesting enough, the Rambam paskins, but if you ate it raw, as much as you did not fulfill the proper mitzvah of consumption of Karban Pesach, you are not chayiv for that. Very interesting. What if you totally overcooked it to the point that you charred it? The Rambam says pater. There's no prohibition in that. See, it's interesting. So overcooking is never the problem. Ultimately, it's just undercooking, which may be part of the problem. All right, so there's a couple of other interesting halachas that the Rambam brings down over here. I'll just mention this last one. He says over here, the Rambam quotes, you can't go ahead and do tzli keder, as we mentioned before, right? So you can't go ahead and cook the Karban Pesach in a pot over a fire and have it roast in its own juices. The Rambam does paskin that it is permitted to baste the Karban Pesach. So this is very interesting. So when it's roasting, you could baste it in whatever you want. It just can't soak in the juices. However, interestingly enough, he writes that halacha lemaisa, he says, mutar lasoch also biyayin, shemen, dvash. This is interesting. Whatever kind of barbecue sauce you want to use, right, you're allowed to use for the Karban Pesach. He says, interestingly enough, chutz min hamayim. This is actually quite fascinating. The one thing apparently you can't baste it in is water. Now here's what's interesting. The prohibition of cooking the Karban Pesach in liquids is only in the preparation of the Karban. After the Karban is prepared, the Rambam says, mutar litabel habasar achar shenitzle b'mashkin peros. You could use whatever dipping sauces you want to for the Karban Pesach, right? Tabo said this is going to be, no question, after Mashiach comes, this is going to be the Karban Pesach dipping sauce bar in the hotel programs is going to be, I'm sure, off the rails, right? So Tabo says, so the idea of this is interesting. So when preparing it, you can baste it in whatever you want except water, but else the dipping sauces afterwards, halacha l'maisa is permitted. Both say last piece of Rambam, and then we'll stop for today. Ein solin es haPesach hagabe kli even o kli matach o shnemar tzli eish lo tzli davar acher. Both say this is incredibly important. The roasting of the Pesach cannot be done on any item other than directly on the fire. So, for example, if you were to take a piece of metal and heat up a piece of metal and put the Karban Pesach on that, or a stone and put the Karban Pesach on that, halacha l'maisa, that would be illegal. Halacha l'maisa in solinoso b'shipot shamateches. We'll see later on that we don't even roast the Karban Pesach on a metal spit, but rather we'll see that we only go ahead and roast the Karban Pesach actually on a wooden spit. And the reason for that is because halacha l'maisa, we're concerned metal heats up, right? Metal conducts heat. The concern is that maybe the metal itself will end up cooking that area of the Karban Pesach, and Karban Pesach can't be cooked by anything other than the direct fire. All right, so we'll stop over here. More about Karban Pesach and Eretz Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, Yashikoach, everyone, a Guten Shabbos. Shalom Aleichem, how are you? It's great to see you. Things are well?
Quick question. Where it says the Shlima Yisra of doing it Ma'ashecha,